From the studio that brings you reformed thinking, this is The Deep Dive. We take the heaviest sources, pull them apart, and give you the knowledge you need to be well-informed. This week, we are stepping back and looking at history, not as a random series of events, but as direct evidence.
That is precisely our context today. We're looking at a really crucial section of Jonathan Edwards' work on the history of redemption. Edwards recounts history from the fall of Adam onward, but then he pauses.
Right. He sort of steps out of the narrative.
He does. He puts on a different hat. He's no longer just the historian. He becomes the logician, the apologist, asking, okay, we have this 6,000-year record. What conclusions can we actually draw from it?
So he's using the data of history to build a case.
A case for a singular, non-negotiable point. The truth and divine authority of the Christian religion and, specifically the scriptures upon which it is built.
I find that whole approach just captivating. He isn't arguing from, say, philosophical axioms or just internal logic alone. He's taking this huge panorama of global events, the wars, the collapses of empires, all of it. And he says, look at these facts. These are not coincidences, they are testimony. Our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize the three core historical arguments he presents. Arguments that, for him, illustrate why the church and its governing document, the scriptures, cannot possibly be a human invention.
That's right. And these three arguments are so powerfully linked. He argues that the historical facts prove that the church is built on the word of God. We'll unpack these facts.
Okay, so what are they?
First, the constant, really unique opposition the church has faced throughout history. Second, the miraculous preservation of the church against all odds despite that opposition. And third, the precise fulfillment of foretold events.
Especially concerning the greatest enemy of the church, Antichrist.
Exactly. The narrative structure itself is the evidence.
Let's start with that first argument, then. It seems the most counterintuitive at first glance.
It does.
Okay, let's unpack this first argument. The perpetual violent hatred the church has experienced throughout history. Using hatred as evidence of divine truth seems, well, it seems backwards, almost like a perverse boast. How does Edwards even start to argue this?
Well, he argues from contraries. And this is, a brilliant move that hinges on the nature of holiness and sin.
Okay.
If something is truly holy, truly separate, and truly contrary to the fallen state of the world, it must attract the malice of that world. The world is defined by wickedness and corruption, and those forces will naturally rise up to oppose what is righteous with an intense malicious fury.
So the intensity of the opposition is a direct indicator of the holiness of the thing being opposed.
Precisely. The sheer intensity, the consistency, and the duration of the opposition is, for Edwards, irrefutable proof of the faith's genuine holiness.
But for that argument to stand, he has to prove that the thing being opposed, the church, is a single, unified entity across time. Otherwise, it's just a series of unrelated conflicts.
He must, and he does. He takes great care to establish this. He views the Church of God as one continuous single society. It stretches from Adam, Enoch, and Noah through the patriarch Abraham, Moses, the Israelitish church, right up to the Christian church in his present age.
So when he talks about different dispensations or ages, he's not saying the church changes its core beliefs, is he?
Not at all. The method of administration changes, the ceremonial law, the clarity of revelation, but the foundation never changes. It is always built on divine revelations, summarized in the scriptures, with Christ and redemption as the sum of it all.
So the opposition is always against this one singular system of belief.
Yes, the doctrine of God's sovereignty, righteousness, and redemption through a promised Messiah. He would say Cain's hatred of Abel's sacrifice was, structurally, the exact same hatred that later heathens directed at Christians who refused to worship Roman gods.
That continuity is key, because it establishes the opposition as perpetual, not just sporadic. We're talking about a conflict that's as old as humanity itself.
It began with the very first murder, Cain killing Abel. It led to the violence before the flood that ultimately overthrew the ancient world. Then post-flood, you see the oppression in Egypt, where God's people were slaves.
Right.
And the constant threat from surrounding nations once Israel entered Canaan. Israel was constantly hated, feared, and harassed. It illustrates that description in Jeremiah 12:9. Mine heritage is unto me as a speckled bird. The birds round about are against her.
The idea of a speckled bird,
Oh.
isolated, unique, and attracting all the raptors.
Mm.
And this hatred, it doesn't just go away. It just changes form over the centuries.
It continued violently.
Yeah.
Think of the periods like the persecution after the Babylonian captivity, which culminated in the horrific acts of Antiochus Epiphanes, who tried to forcibly Hellenize the Jewish religion.
A total erasure of their identity.
Absolutely. Then came the Jewish persecution of Christ and the apostles, followed by the dreadful empire-wide heathen opposition before Constantine the Great. And finally, the yet more violent, spiteful, and cruel opposition of Antichrist during the medieval period and beyond. It is a seamless historical narrative of malice.
Let's pause on the sheer uniqueness of this. You mentioned that Edwards argues no other society or religion has been so insatiably persecuted across ages.
Mhm.
Why is the opposition to this specific religion different from, say, the rivalry between Rome and Carthage or any two warring nations?
It's the nature and the cause of the opposition. I mean, look at other religions. They often coexisted. When they clashed, it was usually for political or territorial reasons, not because of the intrinsic nature of their theology.
Okay, that's a good point.
The Romans were generally quite tolerant of local deities as long as you rendered homage to the imperial cult. But Christianity, and before it, the religion of Israel, demanded exclusivity and holiness. That inherently challenged the established spiritual and moral order of every single surrounding society.
So the hatred isn't geographical or political, it's moral at its root.
It's entirely mortal, and Edwards observes this in The Cruelty. He says the opponents would put their ingenuity upon the rack to invent torments that would be cruel enough. The rack, the cross, boiling in oil. And yet their thirst for blood was never satisfied.
That goes beyond simple punishment.
It's pathological malice. This level of sustained, insatiable hatred suggests a source that is itself perpetual and fundamentally opposed to righteousness.
And Edwards uses the identity of the persecutors to confirm this. He says the opposition came chiefly from heathenism and popery, and the common denominator in both is deep moral corruption.
Exactly. Even critics of Christianity, like the deists of Edwards' time, would have to concede that pagan religions involved obscene rites and widespread idol worship, which were acts of wickedness.
They weren't exactly bastions of virtue.
Not at all. And similarly, when the opposition came from the Jewish leaders in Christ's time, Edwards cites contemporary historians like Josephus to show that the Jewish nation was, at that point, generally steeped in moral decay. The opposition to Christ didn't come from the most righteous elements of Judaism. It came from the most corrupt political and religious factions.
The conclusion, then, is that the opposition is always rooted in the world's wickedness.
It is inescapable. The world's corruption has a mortal, spiritual hatred for this one specific religion. Therefore, the only rational explanation is that this religion, built on the scriptures, is contrary to wickedness, it's holy, and it is truly the cause of God.
Because if it were just another lie,
If the scriptures were merely a pack of lies and abominable delusion invented by enemies of God, then the actual enemies of God, the wicked, the corrupt, the idolatrous, would have no reason to oppose it so fiercely and perpetually.
and embrace it or ignore it,
Exactly. They would either use it as a tool of control or just ignore it as another competing philosophy. The fact that the entire force of human malice is arrayed against it is, for Edwards, historical confirmation of its divine transcendent nature.
that sets the stage perfectly for the second point.
Yeah.
If the world has hated it for 6,000 years, why on earth is it still here? Moving to that second argument, the fact that this constantly assaulted religion has been upheld through all these dangers for nearly 6,000 years, this is the miracle part of the history.
And Edwards calls the survival of the church one of the greatest wonders and miracles to ever occur, something truly singular on the face of the earth. He establishes this by drawing a stark, powerful contrast between the fate of human kingdoms and the fate of the church.
Right, I mean, look at the historical record he would have been reviewing. The Moabites, the Ammonites, the mighty Assyrian and Babylonian empires, Persia, Greece, Rome.
All overthrown, every single one. Babylon fell to the Persians, Persia to the Greek Empire to the Romans. And the great Roman Empire, the longest-lasting political structure of the ancient West, it finally fell, consumed by barbarous nations.
They're all gone.
All gone. Edwards emphasizes Isaiah 51.6. The moth has eaten them up like a garment, and the worm has eaten them like wool, but God's church remains. And here's the key difference. Satan's visible kingdom, that is, the dominant world power structure opposing God, has been overthrown entirely at least once by the flood. The visible kingdom of Christ has never been successfully overthrown.
What makes this preservation so remarkable is that massive imbalance of strength. Edwards really stresses that the church was almost always the weaker party.
Absolutely. The church was, for most of its history, just a remnant, a handful of people.
Right.
Think of the children of Israel in Egypt. They were a tribal group of slaves facing the greatest superpower of the time. In Christ's time, the early Christians were a small cult opposed by the entire Jewish hierarchy and the might of the Roman Empire.
And later, during the darkest times under Antichrist.
The true church was reduced to a small, hidden number, often geographically dispersed and intellectually isolated. And yet their enemies, despite their overwhelming power, could never annihilate them.
And the enemies consistently held the ultimate tool of control, civil authority. The law was on their side.
This is a crucial distinction. In almost every period of extreme persecution Edwards cites, the civil law and the military were on the side of the persecutors. The church members in Egypt were merely slaves under Pharaoh's complete dominion.
There was no recourse.
None. In the time of the Roman emperors, all legal and military power was arrayed against the Christians. And for that vast period of papal ascendancy, the civil authorities, the kings and emperors of Christendom, had given their strength and power to the beast. All secular enforcement was against the persecuted Protestants.
And to compound that imbalance, Edwards notes that the persecuted church often did not rely on self-defense. They adopted a suffering posture.
Right. The early Christians, and many under popish persecution, committed themselves wholly to God rather than mounting some kind of military or political resistance.
So this removes any possibility of attributing their survival to human strategy or military might.
It does. Edwards concludes that it is most plain that the church has not been upheld by its own strength, wisdom, or policy. This is why the church's survival becomes evidence of a higher power.
This brings us to what you called the brink of ruin point. Edwards singles out those historical moments when, by all human calculation, the church should have failed, but God appeared dramatically, making the intervention undeniable.
Yes, let's look at those.
Where do we start?
We begin with the most famous early example, the flood. Wickedness had covered the earth to such an extent that God determined to wipe out the world. By every measure, the covenant people should have become extinct.
It was over.
It should have been. Yet God preserved one family, Noah, and thereby preserved the seed of the church while overthrowing the entire wicked world. This sets the pattern. Global destruction, singular preservation.
And then, the Red Sea. There were physically cornered mountains, the sea, and Pharaoh's entire army closing in. Pharaoh thought he was sure of his prey.
And this is where Edwards sees sovereign timing. God waits until the moment of maximum human helplessness, the literal point of no return, and then he intervenes. He destroys the Egyptian host and delivers the church. Human strength was useless. The deliverance was purely miraculous.
Okay, let's skip forward to the Roman Empire. The 10th heathen persecution under Emperor Diocletian was particularly brutal, wasn't it?
It was deliberately designed to obliterate Christianity from the face of the earth. The persecution was so thorough and so prolonged, it lasted over 10 years, that the persecutors actually boasted they had finished the Christian church.
They really thought they had won.
They minted coins and erected monuments celebrating the extinction of the Christian name. But what happened? In the midst of their triumph, the Christian church rose out of the dust, prevailed completely, and the vast heathen Roman Empire itself collapsed, falling before the very religion it tried to extinguish.
It's an incredible reversal. And this pattern of resurrection is repeated during the Arian heresy.
Yes, which threatened to corrupt the fundamental doctrine of Christ's deity, and it reduced the true church to a small Orthodox remnant. The power of the world, including emperors like Constantius, was engaged to destroy them.
But it failed.
Arianism was gradually overcome, and the true faith reasserted itself. And Edwards sees the exact same pattern during the rise of Antichrist. When the church was forced into the wilderness and reduced to scattered believers, the combined political and ecclesiastical power of Rome could never fully accomplish its design of total extirpation.
This leads to the Reformation, which Edwards describes as the church being wonderfully revived and standing, as it were, on its feet in the sight of his enemies.
This revival wasn't a slow historical drift. It was a sudden, dramatic appearance of truth and power that raised the church completely out of the enemy's reach. Edwards would point to the fact that the Reformation occurred simultaneously in multiple places, catalyzed by key individuals, all while facing these overwhelming military and political threats.
And Edwards brings this right up to his own time with a crucial example for the English-speaking world, The Revolution by King William in 1688. Why is that specific, relatively recent political event so significant to him?
For Edwards, the 1688 revolution was the last major instance of God appearing for deliverance against a concerted popish plot to overthrow the Reformed Church in England and, by extension, Europe. King James II, a Catholic, was actively trying to reestablish Catholicism as the dominant religion.
So there's another one of those existential threats.
A huge one. The successful bloodless invasion by William of Orange, a Protestant, and his subsequent ascendancy to the throne prevented what Edwards viewed as the final political attempt by the forces of Antichrist to extinguish the Reformation in its critical stronghold. It was a visible, last-minute sovereign intervention that secured the religious and political liberty the Church needed to flourish.
So this entire sustained, protected existence, lasting 6 millennia, with God repeatedly causing the Church to flourish after the darkest times. This is evidence of a divine hand. An institution that is statistically impossible to survive, yet must have an external, transcendent protector.
And if God owns the Church, then he owns the revelation, the scriptures on which she is built. The long historical narrative of preservation, which defies all laws of political and military attrition, is Edwards' second great argument for the authority of the Word.
Now we come to the third, and maybe the most detailed piece of evidence, the fulfillment of Scripture prophecy. We've established preservation as a historical miracle. Now we examine it as a predicted event.
That is the crucial link.
It ties the first two arguments together. The opposition makes preservation impossible, and the prediction of that impossibility confirms the divine inspiration of the text.
Yes. The fact of survival is itself a fulfilled prophecy. Edwards argues that the divine authority of the scriptures can be established merely by the fact that the biblical writers foretold this unlikely preservation hundreds, even thousands of years in advance.
They didn't just say the church will be fine. They foretold that opposing kingdoms would fail, that the moth and worm would eat them up, but that God's covenant mercy would continue forever.
Yes, and these are not vague assurances. Edwards draws on powerful, specific, prophetic declarations. Isaiah 54:17, "No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper," and Christ's own assurance in the New Testament, "On this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it."
They knew the opposition was coming.
They knew the church would face overwhelming opposition and be almost swallowed up, and yet they promised its survival. Edwards asks, how could they possibly foresee such an unlikely thing unless they spoke by divine inspiration?
If the church were just a human project, its long-term survival against those odds was a historical and statistical impossibility. So the writers, by predicting the impossible, proved their source was divine.
And now we move to the centerpiece of this argument, and where Edwards spends an enormous amount of time. This specific, detailed fulfillment concerning Antichrist.
Yeah.
For Edwards, following the strong historical interpretation popular during the Reformation, this points directly and irrevocably to the papal system, the Church of Rome, in its temporal and spiritual claims.
We should probably acknowledge that this interpretation is a historical one, rooted in the 16th to 18th century Protestant understanding of prophecy, what's known as historicism.
Yes, absolutely. That's the lens he is using.
So let's look closely at the roadmap that Edwards argues the scriptures laid out for this great opponent.
The specificity is just astonishing. We start with the manner of arrival. It was foretold not as an external pagan power, but as a falling away of the Christian church into a corrupt state. That's from 2 Thessalonians 2:3.
So an enemy from within.
An internal enemy. This historically mirrors the centuries of gradual moral and doctrinal decline within the Western Church before the final emergence of the full papal system.
And the prophecies specify the seat and claim. He would set himself up in the temple or visible church of God, pretending to divine power as the head of the church.
This is critical. It clarifies that this figure is not a secular emperor outside the church, but a pseudo-spiritual power residing within the visible church structure, claiming prerogatives that belong only to Christ.
And the emergence was prophesied to be gradual. It was already working subtly. The mystery of iniquity doth already work, and would only emerge fully once the restraining force was taken out of the way.
And the common interpretation at the time was that this restraining power was the secular Roman Empire. Once the power of the emperors was removed from the West, the Bishop of Rome was free to gradually accumulate temporal and spiritual power over centuries.
Which aligns perfectly with the gradual historical development of papal authority.
It does. Then we have the clear political identity given in Daniel. Antichrist was represented as a little horn rising out of the fourth beast, which signifies a monarch of the Roman Empire.
And the fourth beast is universally identified as the Roman Empire.
Right. The horn represents a successor kingdom that emerges from the fragmentation of that empire. Historically, the papal states and the immense influence of the Pope emerged directly from the chaos of the collapsing Western Roman Empire, asserting dominance over the various Germanic successor kingdoms.
And then perhaps the most geographically striking detail, the location. The seat of this spiritual whore was prophesied to be on 7 mountains or hills. That's Revelation 17.9.
And it was called the Great City, which reigneth over the kings of the earth.
At the time Revelation was written, there is zero ambiguity there.
None. The only city universally known as the City on 7 Hills that reigneth over the kings of the earth was Rome. The prophecy fixed the location of the spiritual power centuries before it ever reached its zenith.
What about its influence? The extent of dominion was also specified. It would reign over peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues.
And all the world should wonder after the beast. For over 1,000 years, from the collapse of Rome until the Reformation, the papal power exercised sweeping spiritual, political, and cultural influence across all of Western Europe, commanding the obedience of princes and peasants alike. The history matches the prophecy.
Okay, now for the character traits. Let's look at the first one. Pride and blasphemy. He was foretold to exalt himself above all that is called God.
And speaking great things and blasphemies, Edward saw this fulfilled in the specific titles and claims of the papacy.
Such as,
Claims of papal supremacy, infallibility, the ability to release souls from purgatory, the right to forgive sins. These are, in the Protestant view, prerogatives belonging solely to God. For a man to assert these claims is, structurally, a form of blasphemy.
the second trait, which ties back to your first argument, is persecution. Described as an exceeding cruel persecutor making war with the saints.
And causing the woman to be drunken with the blood of the saints? The historical evidence of the Inquisition, the wholesale slaughter of groups like the Waldenses and Albigenses, and the religious wars fought against Protestants. The confirmation is just overwhelming.
The scale of the persecution, the bloodshed over centuries, is why they found that image of being drunken with blood so apt.
It's a horrifying image, but they saw it as historically accurate.
Then there's the third trait, craft and policy. Daniel describes the little horn as having eyes like the eyes of a man. What does that signify?
Political wisdom, complex policy, not just brute military force. This speaks to the nature of the Roman Curia and the diplomacy of the papal state. It was often through clever political alliances, maneuvering, and strategic policy, the eyes of a man, that the papacy maintained its power.
And it was foretold that kings would support this power, control over kings. The kings of Christendom would give their power and strength unto the beast.
This refers to the historical reality where European monarchs, through belief or necessity, submitted their political power to the Pope. They enforced papal decrees, they fought papal wars, and they feared the interdict.
The power to essentially excommunicate an entire kingdom.
Yes, which often led to rebellion among the populace. It was an incredible tool of control.
What about the deceptive aspects?
Yuck.
Lying wonders, performing pretended miracles and signs. Edwards looks at the phrase, maketh fire come down from heaven.
And he suggests this may not refer to literal fire, but to the practice of excommunication.
Yeah.
Excommunication, the banishment from the visible church and the pronouncement of divine judgment, was dreaded like literal fire from heaven in the medieval mind. It was a spiritual terror wielded to enforce obedience.
The prophecies are so detailed they even touch on internal church regulations, the doctrinal deviations. 1 Timothy 4.3 foretold the forbidding of marriage and commanding abstinence from meats.
This is maybe one of the most literal and verifiable fulfillments. The mandatory celibacy of the priesthood, enforced by papal decree, and the strict rules about Lenten and other periodic abstinence from certain foods. They are direct, historical, and ongoing deviations that match the prophecy exactly.
We also see predictions about splendor and wealth, that the spiritual whore would be arrayed in purple and scarlet, decked with gold and precious stones.
This opulence, the ceremonial garments, the massive cathedrals, the accumulated treasures, it stands in stark contrast to the humble origins of Christ and the apostles.
And then economic control. It was foretold that no man might buy or sell without his mark.
This speaks to the socioeconomic coercion. Without being in good standing with the church, without the mark of submission, a person could be ostracized, lose their livelihood, and effectively be unable to participate in normal economic life within those strongly Catholic societies.
And most damningly, Revelation mentions the specific items being traded, and it specifically lists the selling of the souls of men.
This is a direct reference to the historical practice of selling indulgences. By purchasing an indulgence, people believed they were securing forgiveness for sins or reducing the time souls spent in purgatory. Edward saw this as literally trading the spiritual standing of human souls for money, making the souls of men a commodity.
Which fulfills that horrifying detail of the prophecy.
Perfectly. And finally, that terrifying detail about not suffering the bodies of God's people to be put in graves.
What does that refer to?
This came to pass regarding those the papacy deemed heretics. The bodies of prominent reformers or martyrs were sometimes denied burial in consecrated ground, or even disinterred and burned as a final act of malice.
The sheer cumulative weight of all these specific details, the location on 7 hills, the doctrine of forbidding marriage, the opulence, the economic control, the cruelty, this is what Edwards uses to construct his argument.
He sees it as unassailable. The only possible source for a text that could predict this many distinct, controversial, and interwoven historical facts stretching over centuries has to be divine inspiration. The prophecy is vindicated by history, and history confirms the scriptures.
So we've established the historical necessity of opposition, the divine guarantee of preservation, and the specific confirmation of prophecy. Now, what does Edwards say this all means for the individual believer? He turns this vast historical view into a vital lesson on the necessary Christian disposition.
Yes, this is the application. The history we have reviewed, 6,000 years defined by persecution and suffering, reveals a crucial lesson about the nature of true faith. Seeing that God has so often ordered the church to be in a suffering state, even an extreme one, proves that the true Christian spirit must be a suffering spirit.
A suffering spirit.
God accommodates the historical state of the church to the spiritual disposition he gives her members.
This shifts the focus from just intellectual assent to internal resolve. Christ's instruction to his disciples about self-denial and taking up the cross wasn't just, abstract spiritual advice. It was preparation for the documented violent reality of historical opposition.
And the historical evidence from the martyrs shows this spirit in action. They faced the absolute worst. Dreadful torments, loss of family, destruction of property. Yet they chose those torments over renouncing Christ. They understood the true calculus of faith, choosing to sell all for the pearl of great price.
And Edwards uses this history to hold a mirror up to his contemporary audience and to us.
He does. The history confirms the necessity of having a spirit willing to renounce worldly ease, worldly profit, honor, and even one's whole existence for Christ and the gospel. And this is where he offers a crucial challenge to the listener.
Okay.
He applies that powerful question from Jeremiah 12:5. If thou hast run with the footmen, and they have wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses?
Let's break that down. Who are the footmen and who are the horses in this context?
The footmen are the relatively lighter, common trials of providence in a time of peace and religious liberty like Edward's time or largely our own.
Okay.
They are the minor inconveniences, the small sacrifices, the social pressures, the conflicts with nominal Christians, or the financial difficulties that every believer faces. If these footmen wear you out, if these small trials cause you to stumble or complain, then you lack the spiritual strength to face the horses.
And the horses are the great, terrible trials, the life or death persecutions of former ages. The rack, the fire, the threat of total ruin for believing.
Exactly. If we cannot endure the light challenges now, how could we possibly handle the terrible persecutions faced by the martyrs?
So Edwards' message is that the spirit of the true believer is historically unified.
Yes. Every true believer has the potential spirit of a martyr. The heart of the Christian must possess a willingness to suffer as a martyr, even if providence never calls them to actual martyrdom. If your faith crumbles under the pressure of a footman, the history of the church demonstrates that your faith is not the same quality as the faith that God has supernaturally preserved through 6 millennia.
It makes our current spiritual posture directly accountable to the historical record of faithfulness.
Absolutely. The historical knowledge prevents the command to take up the cross from becoming a spiritual abstraction. It becomes a practical test. Does your heart truly value Christ above comfort, property, and life? The martyrs answered yes, and their history demands the same answer from us.
Finally, we have to look forward. The historical faithfulness of God regarding the past provides an ironclad assurance for the future.
It does. The scriptures foretell many great things yet to be fulfilled before the world ends. The massive conversions of the Gentiles, the glorious state of the church, the final judgment. These future events may seem difficult or far off, even impossible from our current vantage point.
Just like the prophecy of a small church surviving the Roman Empire once seemed impossible.
Exactly. Yet, we see the consistent faithfulness of God to his promises. Edwards encourages us to quote Joshua 23:14 concerning what God has done so far for his church, that not one thing hath failed of all that the Lord our God hath spoken concerning his church. All things have come to pass agreeable to the divine prediction.
So this history should strengthen our faith in the remaining promises.
It should stir us up to earnest, persistent prayer to God for the accomplishment of the great and glorious things which yet remain. The same reliable divine hand that protected the church at the Red Sea, saved it from the heathen emperors, and delivered it at the Reformation, is guiding the conclusion of history. We should trust the promised outcome.
This has been a necessary, historically grounded deep dive into Edwards' three proofs for the truth of Christianity. The three arguments are so structurally linked, the consistent opposition from the world confirms the holiness of the faith. The miraculous preservation through 6 millennia confirms God's sovereign protection. And the detailed fulfilled prophecies, especially concerning the specific features of Antichrist, confirm the divine origin of the scriptures themselves.
And the most crucial insight we gain from Edwards is that this historical knowledge fuels our spiritual posture. The knowledge of the documented opposition makes the call to take up the cross a practical test of one's disposition. We must constantly check if we possess that suffering spirit necessary to follow Christ wherever the historical work of redemption leads us.
We have seen how incredibly specific past prophecies were, details on location, wealth, specific doctrines like forbidding marriage, and economic activity like selling souls. So considering the remaining prophetic visions regarding the final glorious state of the church, when nations will be brought under the banner of Christ, and knowing how literal the past fulfillments were, we have to ask a final question. How might the world's current political, economic, and social structures need to shift to accommodate a fulfillment as literal and detailed as the rise and description of Antichrist? This history is not yet finished, and its conclusion requires our faith, our reflection, and our earnest prayer.